First Kings chapter 3 tonight. Not going to be able to, it's the third week we're still in chapter 3 and have to get through 2 Kings this quarter too. Really not going to stay forever on a lot of these parts. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first chapters of the book very much kind of set the tone for the book. Remember, we mentioned that really for the fact that the time period of Kings is really several centuries. The fact of the matter is the book really focuses upon three eras, three reigns in particular. It focuses upon Solomon's at the beginning, kind of as a programmatic description of the beginning of the fall of the kingdom, and then it focuses on Ahab and Jezebel and that mess. And then it kind of does Hezekiah and Josiah kind of tag team at the end, and that's kind of the way the book works. So this beginning part's important to kind of get the big picture of the potential of the kingdom of God on earth and the seeds of its failure going all the way back to Solomon himself. So again, a lot of thematic observation as well as we do spot reading here and there. We're going to do a fair amount of reading from the text tonight, I might add. But chapter 2 of the book, basically, David dies. But his farewell speech there in the first few verses of chapter 10, David gives Solomon instruction on how to secure his reign, because there is rebellion afoot. Remember in chapter 1, David finally decides to act like king again, kind of with the prodding of Bathsheba and Nathan. Decides to act like king again because otherwise Abijah is about to usurp the throne. Kind of rip it out from under Solomon, and David's doing nothing about it. And so finally David becomes King David again. We noticed that in the text last week, right? All of a sudden now it's King David, King David. He's finally acting like a king again, even though he's an old, exhausted man. One last time he's got to dig deep and act like a king. And his farting instructions to Solomon are basically clean out the rebels. And so here's what's interesting. This is going to be the transition that we're going to see here as we turn now to chapter 3, a very pivotal chapter in the evolution of Solomon as the great Messianic king of peace. In chapter 2, it's a bloody chapter. In a lot of ways, Solomon kind of looks like his daddy. He solves problems how? By killing people. And that's not necessarily to say it's immoral. David, just like David's killing was often legitimated by God. In fact, David showed times in his life in which he restrained his hand from bloodshed, recognizing it was not the right time and place to kill, right? Like the couple of times he spared Saul's life, even though he was being egged on by his followers. God has given him into your hand. And David realized that was not the right time or way to kill Saul. But nonetheless, in fact, why was David refused from the opportunity to build the temple itself? Yeah, just he's a warrior king, man. Way too much blood on his hands to build the kingdom of peace, as it were. And so it's ironic that Solomon starts his reign with what? Basically a massive bloodshed. Cleaning out the rebels. But then something happens as we turn from chapter 2 into chapter 3. Even though David's kind of encouraged Solomon to show himself to be a wise man by how he deals with his enemies, and Solomon rather, it's almost kind of like a mafia scene, right? Where just guys are being killed right and left, and he's sending out Benaiah, his hitman, to deal with stuff. Then we turn to chapter 3 where having solved the problem the way David would have, that doesn't mean it was immoral, that just means David was called upon to be a warrior in blood for God's cause. And Solomon kind of starts out that way, and you're sitting there beginning to wonder, how can this guy do the things he's been kind of prophesied, so to speak, to do? We come to chapter 3 where having dealt with the immediate threat of the rebels, that part of it's done. Chapter 3, beginning verse 1, one of the more familiar episodes in Solomon's life, though we often miss the fact. In fact, actually, look at the very last verse of chapter 2. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon, but it was established David style. Then we get this one little bit of kind of almost, if you're watching this as a movie, right? We use movies as analogies a lot because that's the modern form of storytelling. You see a little bit of an ominous peak. And what's the ominous peak here at the beginning of chapter 3? What's the ominous note that sounds? Yeah, his first marriage is not to a good Israelite girl. It's to who? Yeah, daughter of Pharaoh. Is he supposed to do that? No, he is not. And so even though the rest of chapter 3, boy, it sounds real good, and he says the right things to God, and God is very impressed, this is how the story is told. There are these ominous notes gradually sounded here and there until eventually, late in the reign, which I hope that we get to tonight, it becomes a crescendo of, to use a musical analogy, it becomes a crescendo of bad stuff. But the whole point is when we get to chapters 9, 10, and 11, in the crescendo of problems in Solomon's character and Solomon's reign, where does it start? It starts with those little glimpses in an otherwise good time. And what's the message here for us, by the way? What would be the message of that? What's the lesson to be learned here? Say again? Oh, yeah, that's one. Yeah, be careful who you marry. Absolutely. And that should go without saying because, again, marriages are destinies. For those of us who are parents, here's something to keep you up tonight. Teach your kid as well as you want. Teach them the way of the Lord. Build as much character in them as you can. You know what's going to affect them as much as you're teaching? Who they marry. Because you know what's going to happen? You had them for 18 years. Formative years, I grant you, but 18 years. That person they marry gets them for the next 50, including 30 after you're dead. It's just how it is. If you haven't thought about it that way, hope you can still sleep tonight. I'm in that same boat too. I got 4 kids. I get it. But marriage matters. And again, you'll think about, again, we talked about this before, but other stories in this very book of Kings. What happens to Ahab? Her name was Jezebel. Say again? Yeah, that's right. Nobody names their daughter Jezebel. That's how bad it was. So here's the thing. Certainly the lessons in marriage itself, but here's the other thing. The failure of a life over the long term doesn't come all at once. It starts with little things tolerated that in by themselves seem insignificant at the time or not that big a deal, especially in the midst of an otherwise optimistic and generally good section of life. But those little things, it's kind of like, I don't know, man, I'm thinking of analogies. You remember the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up in 1986. Remember that? What brought that ship down? A small flame in the wrong place for about 60 seconds as a blowtorch on a big tank of liquid oxygen. And that was what happened, a small thing. How many buildings have been, have come down over the years because of small imperfections in the foundation or in the building of it, right? How many times do we find out that, when somebody drops dead suddenly and tragically, in the autopsy we found out they had some sort of congenital birth defect from their very birth, some sort of small defect in their heart, or maybe in the blood vessels in their the veins in their brain that caused the stroke. But basically the seeds of the death, of the loss of a tragedy were sown in the very beginning. Here's Solomon doing so much right early on, but the seeds, and that's what the story's going to work. The way this story is told is as in these early, very positive, optimistic chapters in which Solomon is doing so much right, we're getting these little glimpses and pieces of little imperfections in the construction of his life that are going to lead, again, to the catastrophe at the end of his life and setting up the downfall of his son Rehoboam. And so what's, again, the warning to us? The little small things you tolerate in your life that don't seem to be a very big deal, over the long term do tend to become big deals. Little things matter just like the big stuff. And that's what we miss as often. It's kind of like people who get into financial trouble and need financial counseling, that to get out of debt or stay out of debt or they've bankrupted themselves. And what often happens when people get financial counseling, what really turns out is it wasn't, the too big of a mortgage or the car payment that killed them. You know what killed them? It was the daily Starbucks habit. It was the $4 and $5 here and there over the course of a month of a year that added up to become the real catastrophe. It's the little things that bring us down, and it's the little things that lead to the big things. And that's the warning of Solomon's life. So much good, but here and there in these early chapters, these little ominous notes, these little ominous anticipations. Be careful how you build your life. It's not just the big stuff. It's the little tolerated things that add up. Or seemingly little, better way to put it, seemingly little. All right. And so he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. And the people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Should Solomon have done something about that? Correct answer is Yes. Yes. He should have done something about this. Once they went into the land, was there one altar they were supposed to sacrifice at, even if the temple itself had not been built yet? Correct answer is yes. What does Solomon do about that? Just like he tolerates some seemingly small things in his own house, he tolerates improper worship. And why? Because there's a little bit of an excuse you can be had. Well, there's no temple yet. And so I get if people get tired of going down to the tabernacle to offer their sacrifices there. What's the problem with that reasoning, though? If it's inconvenient to go where the tabernacle is, it's still going to be inconvenient for some people to do what once the temple's built? Go to the temple. You got to deal with what God said all the way through. And so Solomon as king, what should he have done as king? This is where we worship. This is how we worship. This is his job. Little things that become big things. Because, by the way, what's going to make it easier for the kingdom to split when Jeroboam, does his bit after Solomon's dead? Yeah, it's just not convenient to go to Jerusalem. Even when the temple is built, it's just not convenient to go to Jerusalem. So we need some altars in Bethel and in Dan. Convenience is the watchword of religion, right? Always worship in the most convenient place. And so again, these little things that become huge catastrophes down the road. So much good, and yet already these tiny tolerations become the problem. And here's the paradox, verse 3. What does the text say? On the flip side, yet Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places himself. That word only is a pretty big word in that context, isn't it? And again, what's the warning all the way through this we're being told? It's the small stuff. And here's the paradox, and here's what all of us need to understand. It is possible to love the Lord in a legitimate way and not fully obey him. And because we can't hold those two things in tension sometimes, we begin to think that we're loving, that we can love the Lord and these tiny tolerations won't lead to problems down the road. I have heard people over the years on what I do. People, when you try to push them over some erroneous belief or some erroneous religious practice, they'll say, yes, but I love the Lord and the Lord knows my heart. Well, yeah, I've read that in the Bible somewhere too. And that story didn't work out well for that man either. Just because we can sentimentally say I love the Lord does not mean that will save us or preserve us from falling into deep and serious sin. And so we keep reading. And the king went to Gibeon. Gibeon was where the tabernacle was at that point. So that's what's interesting is he'll still do that too. And by the way, that's part of the other lesson to be learned all the way through the book of Kings, not just Solomon. Often the spiritual failure begins with not leaving the Lord for apostasy. The spiritual failure begins with doing what God says plus the worldly stuff. Apostasy doesn't come out of nowhere like that. It starts again with the small syncretisms, with the small mixing of the world and the ways that God did not approve of, along with keep on doing what you're supposed to be doing. You see what Solomon's doing there? He's not worshiping, he's not choosing one or the other. What's he doing? He's doing both. He'll go into the tabernacle like he should in Gibeon, because that's where it was in those days. And he'll do it there, but he'll also participate in the sloppiness, the religious sloppiness of the people, rather than leading them to Gibeon with him. That's how it works, folks. It's death, it's a spiritual death by 1,000 small compromises. And I just belate this because I think this is one of the greatest downfalls of so many Christians and so many congregations. Or sometimes, again, we wonder in time how our kids wound up where they're at. It's the small things we don't deal with that lead to apostasy in the next generation. Your children will always take your compromises further than you ever did. You can bank on that. And so here's Solomon. But at Gibeon, so at the high places, where does the Lord appear to Solomon? When he's where he's supposed to be. And he comes to Gibeon in a dream by night and says, ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, you have shown great and steadfast love. That's chesed, loyalty to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness, uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love. And I've given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out and come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. You've kept your word to Abraham, in other words. Give your servant there, literally in Hebrew, a listening heart. A listening heart. You listen to God's word. You listen to what God says. A listening heart, Somehow in the ESV it becomes an understanding mind. To govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. And this is crucial because that language of discern between good and evil, what does that remind you of? Say again, someone louder. Still can't hear you. Yes, the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the problem was in the garden, Eve tried to. But here Solomon instead does what? He says, I need you to teach me how to discern good and evil. It's not mine to take, but Lord, it's yours to give, and I ask you for that. And so there's something much profounder than a lot of us catch in what Solomon is doing here. This is, and there's going to be a lot of echoes of Eden in chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. These echoes of Eden, starting right here in some ways with Solomon not reaching for and taking in arrogance like Saul did, but rather asking God to give what he needs. And why does he need to discern between good and evil? Because he's, in a sense, another Adam in the garden. When Adam follows God and discerns good and evil, things go well. When Adam eats of the fruit and just takes it on his own terms, then what happens? It all falls apart. And so while Solomon is willing to listen to God, this listening heart to receive from God the definitions of good and evil and how to discern between them, things are going to go well. And the Lord is therefore all the more deeply impressed with Solomon. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, because you've asked this, and didn't ask for long life or riches or even for the life of your enemies, but instead asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has ever been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. And I will also give you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will also lengthen your days. And Solomon woke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem, and he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings, peace offerings, made a feast for all his servants. And then, again, a story we normally separate, in our kids' Bible classes and how we teach sometimes, at least the kind of kids' Bible classes I grew up in. I forget what we do in the back. But this story is meant to be an illustration of how Solomon's prayer has been fulfilled. This is the famous story of the two prostitutes and the two babies, one dead, one alive, right? And what does Solomon have to do then here as an illustration of what God has implanted in him now? What does Solomon have to do? Discern between good and evil. That's what Solomon has to do. He has to discern between good and evil. One woman's lying, one woman's not. And what's also interesting as well is now that God has granted Solomon, in a sense, his own wisdom, you'll notice that Solomon calls for a sword, and you think we're about to have more what? You're about to have more bloodshed, but what happens? What's the sudden? Now that he's got God's wisdom, what do we avoid? We actually avoid bloodshed and still amazingly come to the right solution to the problem. Good and evil are discerned and no violence is had. It is the beginning of in a sense, the Messianic reign of peace where think about this, we forget this sometimes, Solomon as the anticipation of Jesus' eternal Messianic reign. The lion lays down with the lamb, every man under his vine and his fig tree. And what's one of the other aspects of it? There will be no more war or bloodshed in all my holy mountain. The ability to bring peace, to govern well, to deliver justice, to set all things right, to give everybody their due. And the day of the sword is over. To set all things right. And guess what? Now with God's help, what can Solomon do? He can deliver that. Yes, sir, Dale.
And it's example, a lead up to Jesus being able to make that discernment about all of our lives.
Correct. That's exactly right. That is the essence of what a king is supposed to do. Why Absalom complained about David not giving justice. The true king gives to everybody exactly what they should have. And that's part of it. But it takes a certain wisdom, not just like the power to deliver, just takes a certain wisdom to rightly do that. And so again, you even think about Isaiah chapter 9, that Isaianic prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. The government will be upon his shoulders. I mean, the idea that he will be the one who will finally be able to do this perfectly and on an eternal, universal scale. But this is the down payment of it because Solomon asked for a listening heart and God delivers. And we get to the end of the chapter, verse 28. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe because of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And short of the wisdom of God, folks, no earthly king or judge or anybody's ever going to give you justice. If you think politics and voting for the right person next election are going to deliver that, you're wasting your time. Vote for the best choice or best candidate you think is out there, but if you're looking for justice with a capital J in this life, where does it come from? Wisdom of God. And we know now who is the one in whom that wisdom dwells, and it's not any of us. It's Jesus. All right, so chapter 4, with this, he can discern good and evil. We have the return of, in a sense, an Edenic, a Messianic kingdom, an Edenic existence. And so verses 1 through 20 of chapter 4, it seems kind of boring, but it's really not. It's important. You know what Solomon is doing? He's naming and appointing things. What did David do in the garden to show his dominion and that he was able originally to discern rightly when he followed God? Oh, I'm sorry, Adam. Thank you, Adam. He names the animals. He puts everything in their right place, right? That's a mark of wisdom to know how and where everything should be named and where they go. That's what Adam does in the garden. What does Solomon do in his kingdom? Boring detail to us, but it's almost like the equivalent of in Genesis if we had all the names of the animals as Adam went through and did that. Solomon knows how to rightly and well order his kingdom. He's a king who knows what he is doing. And so it seems boring to us, but that's what happens. And the summary in verse 20 of all of this rightly ordering of his kingdom is this. So Judah and Israel were as many as the sand of the sea, i.e. Abraham's promise is being fulfilled. And they ate and they drank and were happy. It's Eden. Everything going great. They have a great Messianic king, a true anointed one, heir of David. And he's got the wisdom of God in him. He listens, and it goes well because he knows how to rightly order things and put things in their place. And so we keep going with this echo of Eden. Verse 21, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. In the ancient world, the way you knew that people put themselves under you is if they'll write the check, if they'll send the tribute. That's how you knew. And so from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt, basically almost all of the known world at that point does what? Recognizes Solomon as a reign. And that's important because literally for the first time since God promised Abraham the land, now we see the full extent of the land. You go back to Genesis chapter 15, I think it's about verse 18, but in Genesis chapter 15, this is the scope of the land. When God gets down to the specifics with Abraham after he's in Canaan, this is the extent of the land God says to Abraham, this is what I'm giving you. And now here we are. The Messiah, so to speak, has brought it to pass. And there it is. That's where Solomon reigns, and everybody writes the check to him. All the wealth of the nation goes to the Messianic king. That's an image actually Revelation picks up on as well in the picture of the new heavens and the new earth and the heavenly Jerusalem, that the wealth of the nations comes to it. There's 20 themes, 20 ideas in the Bible. It's all it is. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And that's right. And lest we forget this, remember his name literally means peace. Solomon in Hebrew is Shlomo, which sounds like shalom because they're from the same word. That's the whole point. And by the way, peace is not just the absence of violence, though it is that. It's also the flourishing. And the people were happy. And so then we see, again, and I don't think in verses 22 and 23 we're meant to see excess. We're just meant to see the depth, the extent, how magnificent his household was, that this is what he has to provide. Because it's not literally Solomon ate all this stuff. The idea is he takes care of his own, his people. But his household was so grand and so substantial that this is what it took to feed him day by day. Can you imagine this? And an enormous amount of food to feed his household. And look at the language of verse 24. And he had, and what's your word say there? He had dominion. What's that word make you think of? Genesis. What originally in the pre-fall state, what were Adam and Eve supposed to have over creation? They were supposed to have that word, dominion. And so he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipshah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates. He had peace to Dale's Point. He had peace on all sides. And Judah and Israel lived in safety, even from Dan to Beersheba, every man under his vine and his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. And let's not miss that echo of what the Messiah provides. Go through Micah chapter 4 real quick. Micah chapter 4. Micah is centuries after this time. Centuries after this time. And so the decline of the decay is substantial by that point in the southern kingdom. Micah was sent to the southern kingdom. He was sent to Judah and Jerusalem. Kingdom had split by that point way back. And we're well into the decline and the decay of the Davidic house and the nation. And so Micah, in one sense, is sent to call them back to repentance. But even in the midst of that repentance, look at the language of Micah chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains. It shall be lifted up to the hills. People shall flow in it. We'll see that a little bit more here in Kings yet in a minute with what happens in Solomon's day. Then the people shall flow to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob, the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between many peoples. He shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. Spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall sit every man under his vine and his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. That's what they had in Solomon's day in a limited sense. This is what they've lost as the book goes on. This is what Jesus comes to restore in a way that has never been fulfilled on the level he's about to fulfill it. But hear the echoes of these messianic ideas, and as we keep reading here. And Solomon also had, and this is the power again of these little things, verse 26, so much, so right, so blessed, so Edenic. But then verse 26, Solomon also had 40,000, probably more accurately 4,000, probably a typo in the Hebrew manuscripts there. Chronicles says 4,000, so do the Greek versions of this reading. But still, 4,000 horses is 4,000 too many. Because what was Solomon told, or what were all the kings of Israel rather told back in Deuteronomy? No horses, no chariots. Why? Because if you have horses and chariots, that's the ancient version of F-22s, what do you tend to do? You tend to go to war, and you become the bully, and also, where do you tend to put your faith? In my F-22s. Why do you think God had Israel walk around Jericho all those days? What was the lesson? You don't fight. Who does the fighting? God does. Remember one of my favorite stories in all the Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 5. David understood this. David asked God, what am I supposed to do about the Philistines? God basically tells David, if I can paraphrase loosely, wait until you hear the marching and the sounds of the tops of the trees, and then you follow. What was David going to wait until he heard? God's army going out. Elisha's servant, 2 Kings chapter 6, is terrified when they're surrounded by the Syrian army there at Dothan. And Elijah prays what? God opened his eyes so that Elisha's servant could see what? Hills filled with chariots of fire, because who was there the whole time? The real army. Problem is, when you used to have 4,000 horses and chariots, what do you begin to think? I don't have to wait on God. I can sleep well or not sleep well at night because of the size or lack of size of my army. And so again, seemingly little things that were just thrown in here in the midst of so much good, so much possibility. Solomon also had 4,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon, for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for the horses, swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required according to each's duty. And so again, these little notes snuck in with no additional commentary yet, because again, the way the Bible likes to work is it likes to show you more than tell you sometimes. If you know Deuteronomy, should you be concerned? You should be concerned. But no commentary yet. So we go on, verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman and Calcol and Darda and Malcolm Gladwell and the sons of supposed wise men of the day. Some of you read his book, some of you don't. Point being, his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005. And look at verse 33 and following. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, of birds, of reptiles, of fish. In other words, he's a master of creation like Adam was in the beginning. He knows all about all this stuff and how it works and where it goes and so forth. He's like another Adam with feet of clay. Like Adam in the garden, he can name things, he can organize things. He knows exactly how to arrange the world and have dominion. But with feet of clay. We've already seen he's got the wife. We've already seen he fudges on the high places. Now he's got a bunch of horses and chariots he ought not have. And then starting in chapter 5, we get down to the beginning of the construction of the temple. And for sake of time, we will kind of quickly jump through, and we'll jump to the end of chapter 6 as the construction goes on. And the image of the construction are important, by the way. For sake of time, you can read this on your own time. You go to chapter 6 and read it at length. The description of the construction of the temple, it's made to be another Garden of Eden. You know what are carved on the trees inside the temple? I just said that, didn't I? You know what's carved on the walls? Can you guess now? What's carved on the walls on the inside of the temple? Trees. Why? Because it's Eden. It's the original place where God and man dwelled together, and man was meant to worship God. Again, all this is meant to echo Eden. And we get that sometimes, right? Go to the end of the Bible, book of Revelation, chapter 21 and 22, when the New Jerusalem, the eternal city, comes down. It has aspects of what in it? Eden. Tree of life is there. The river that flows through it, even the streets of gold. We miss this, but go back and read Genesis 2. Eden's associated with gold. It was the original most holy place where God and man could meet, and man could worship God unfettered with complete access before the veil came to keep him out of there because of his sin. And the temple is, again, meant to be a down payment back to that. But the problem is we get to the end of chapter 6, and we read this, again, chapter break in a really unfortunate place. Because we read this, I'm going to pick up in verse 38, literally the last, actually I'm starting in verse 37. But again, chapter break in a really unfortunate place because it breaks up the contrast we're meant to see here now. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. And the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts according to its specifications. Solomon was 7 years in building it. Pretend there's no chapter break. Keep reading. Solomon was building his own house 13 years. And he finished his entire house. That chapter break is in the worst possible place because you're not meant to see a break. You're meant to see a contrast. What's the contrast? Double. And then what happens if chapter 6 was this lengthy description of what he built as the temple? What happens in the following verses of chapter 7 now is a description of what he built for himself. And while in terms of the space in the text, it doesn't take up as much space. If you work out loud the dimensions and the scope of what he built, you know what he did? He built himself way more than he built for God in terms of size and scope. And as we keep reading on to, again, the things he'd done, and eventually we read about the kind of throne that he built for himself, and this spectacular gold, the fact of the matter is he built himself to rival, perhaps even surpass the temple. And that's part of the story, again, that we miss sometimes. The inspired storyteller doesn't want us to miss that. That chapter break is in literally one of the worst possible places because we're meant to see that he spent almost twice as much time building his own place as he built for God. And again, the scope and scale of what he built for himself rivals, if not surpasses, what God got. Boy, is that a far cry from when David, as king, takes Jerusalem. And what's David's first job to do? Bring the ark to Jerusalem in a way of saying what? Who's king? God is. And why does David even want to build a temple in the first place? Because David says, I shouldn't dwell in a nice house when God's ark dwells in what? A tent. Not seeing that kind of same attitude out of Solomon here. And that's what the text is meant to not tell us yet, but show us these little things that are starting to become kind of bigger. Now Solomon's starting to revel a little bit, or at least allow what happens too often, which is when you become wealthy and successful, what begins to happen? When you are wealthy and successful and powerful, you begin to become a little bit greater in your own eyes. And so again, we see an unremarked upon, but showing us a warning sign that all is not well. And from there we go back now, we go back to the finishing of the temple furnishings themselves. The temple furnishings themselves. And that brings us down to chapter 8, one of the most important chapters in the book because of the way it kind of anticipates what's going to happen. Because what happens in chapter 8, and boy, are we pushing for time here. What happens in chapter 8 is now the temple is finished and furnished. That's fun to say. It's finished and furnished. And now it's time to dedicate it. Just like when in Exodus, when Moses finished building and furnishing the tabernacle, they had a ceremony in which what happens? The cloud comes down. The cloud comes down and drives everybody off of the platform. And in fact, when you get down, when you get down to, verse 10 of chapter 8. And when the priests came out of the holy place, that is, they've taken the ark in and moved it into its permanent resting place there in the temple. When the priests came back out of the holy place, just like in Exodus with the tabernacle, a cloud filled the house of the Lord so that now it was the priests who could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Just like in Exodus when God's cloud moved into the tabernacle, so too here. And now what we have, Solomon's kind of dedicatory speech, if you will, here. But for our purposes, what we really need to see then is the prayer that he follows up the dedication speech with, starting in verse 22. And so Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of the assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven and said, O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant, showing steadfast loyalty to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept word with your servant David, my father, what you declared to him. You spoke with your mouth, and with your hand you have fulfilled it this day. Now therefore, O Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, what you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel. If only your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me as you have walked before me. Now, therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant David, my father. But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet you, by the way, that's important. Again, so many anticipations. What's one of the problems in Jeremiah's day at the end with the people and their attitude towards the temple? Maybe you remember Jeremiah's famous temple sermon, Jeremiah chapter 7. What's the problem with the attitude of the people about this place? The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. That's right. As long as we have this place, God is okay. And God will never destroy this place because it's his temple. They forgot what Solomon knew the day he dedicated the place. It's just a building. It's just sticks and bricks. It's just a building. God's way bigger than that. And Jeremiah's day, the people have come to presume upon that God would never destroy it because it's his house. No, all of creation is still too small of a temple for God. They lost sight of what Solomon knew. Drop down verse 30. Listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. And in heaven your dwelling, when you hear, forgive. By the way, that line may help us understand why in the days of Daniel in exile, when Daniel prayed and was well known for praying in that famous story about the lion's den in chapter 6, what direction did Daniel turn to pray? Toward Jerusalem. Daniel knew his book. Daniel knew the stories in the scriptures. He knew the prophecies. He knew the prayers. Because what was Daniel often praying for, apparently? Restoration. Later in the visions, late in the book, it makes clear that that's what he was praying for because an angelic messenger comes and says, God has heard your prayer. And that's why I'm here to tell you about how there's going to be restoration and rebuilding. Verse 31, if a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in his house, then hear in heaven act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct in his own head, vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to all his righteousness. When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn against you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people and bring them again to the land that you gave their fathers. Sounds like an anticipation of what might happen. Bring us back to the land? What's he talking about? Exile, or at least losing some of the land? When heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you. Wait a second. Are these things that are going to happen in the book? Yeah. Yeah. What's this stuff about heaven shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you? That's going to be Elijah's story with Ahab. Yeah, just because the kingdom splits doesn't mean that God doesn't deal with both peoples on the same terms of the same covenant. And so when heaven is shut up, there's no rain because they've sinned against you. If they pray toward this place, acknowledge your name, and turn from their sin when you afflicted them, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people, when you teach them the good way in which they should walk. Grant rain upon your land, which you have given your people's inheritance. If there is famine in the land, wait a second, is that going to happen in this book? Yeah, that's coming too. If there is pestilence or blight or mildew or locust or caterpillar, if the enemy besieges them in the land at their gates, is that going to happen in this book? Yeah, what's happening in the days of Hezekiah? Why has he got to turn to God? And one of the things that really impresses God about Hezekiah is the way he turns to him in the temple, no less, when the Rabshakeh sends that nasty letter saying, don't trust in God. Where was the army? At the gates of Jerusalem. Whatever plague, are there going to be plagues in this book that run rampant through the people? Yeah, that's going to happen. Whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all your people, Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart, stretching out his hands toward this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive and act, and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways. For you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. Likewise, when a foreigner who is none of your people Israel comes from a faraway country for your name's sake, for he shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. When he comes and when he prays toward this house, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you. Wait a second, is that going to happen in this book? Kinda. What's the guy's name? Naaman. He doesn't exactly turn towards the temple, but what does he do? He shows up and says, I've heard there's a great God in this land. Why is he here? Because that little nameless girl says, there's a great God in Israel. Oh, I wish my master were there. And he comes because of the great name of God he's heard about. Doesn't quite get it all right, but this story's going to play out. And for sake of time, long story short, you get the point. Solomon's prayer in many ways anticipates a lot of what's coming in this book. It is meant to be programmatic. And because of that, then what's interesting and what's important is to see what God says or how God responds. That's chapter 9, beginning of chapter 9. Having uttered this kind of a prayer, chapter 9, beginning of verse 1, as soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, just like the first time at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, in other words, all these other kings we're about to read about in this book, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them. And the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. How does it stand in 2 Kings chapter 25 at the end of the book? It's a heap of ruins. Why? Because of what we're reading about right here, right now. And this house will become a heap of rooms. Everyone passing it by will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done thus to this house and to this land? And then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold of other gods, and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought on them all this disaster. And then what happens from this point on through the rest of the book is we have the story of Solomon's failures. These little warning things that we were shown, but we didn't get explicit commentary on yet. Now it begins to pick up speed a little bit more, and we begin to realize this stuff's been a problem, and that these little things he's been tolerating, despite so much good, despite the fact that he loved the Lord. His heart was divided ultimately, and you can't serve God in mammon. You can't serve God in yourself. You can't serve God in another person, a wife, a husband, somebody who matters more to you, and their happiness matters more to you than doing right by God first. And Solomon's heart is divided, and the text is going to make that clear. He may have loved the Lord, but he did not love the Lord wholly and completely. And now these little glimpses we've seen, tolerating the people worshiping at the high places, himself occasionally joining in, even if he did still go to Gibeon. The Egyptian wife, the 4,000 horses and chariots. Now the bill is going to begin coming due. And again, perhaps the greatest warning sign of all, his house is twice as much, so to speak, as God's. Now the rest of this story begins to unravel. And the very things that God has warned about here in chapter 9 are brought out explicitly, not with Ahab or not with some other king down the road, but they're brought out with Solomon himself. The seeds of chapter 2 Kings 25 are sown right here at the beginning when Solomon himself refuses to be wholly the Lord's. And let's understand something here again too. Understand this. This is going to be true all the way through Kings. Many of them, the kings and the people, did not stop worshiping Yahweh. They just worship Yahweh and Baal, Yahweh and Asherah, Yahweh and Molech or Chemosh. That becomes very clear in the prophet Ezekiel, where Ezekiel will talk about, again, when God shows Ezekiel into the temple and himself in a vision and says, look at all these idols in here. They didn't quit worshiping God. They never denied God. They thought you could worship God in mammon. The quintessential human temptation is not to ditch God, it's to put God as one of several gods in our lives, and almost never the highest. And that's, again, the warning to all of us. You won't stop loving God, you'll just love God and another lover, spiritually speaking. Make sense? That's the warning of Solomon. Scott, is that a hand? Yes, yep. Yes. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, we miss that sometimes. But the aspects of the end of Deuteronomy and the end of Leviticus, where the blessings and curses of the law are given out, are almost prophetic as well in terms of the way they anticipate exactly what's going to happen. And that's also part of the point of the way Kings works. Kings is written knowing these things as well. Kings is written to tell the story in a way that shows that all came to pass exactly as they were warned about. Which, by the way, as a sidebar, leads to kind of the common question a lot of people wrestle with, which is if Solomon is so wise, how does this happen? Wisdom and knowledge are not I think most of us get this, but we just need to be reminded of it. Wisdom and knowledge are not, salvation themselves. They're not a buffer to make it impossible. What ultimately determines where we wind up, how our lives turn out, and even what our eternal destiny is going to be, has nothing to do with knowledge or wisdom. It has everything to do with will and love. Show me what you love, and I'll show you what you become, no matter how much you know or how otherwise wise you are in life. If you show me what you love, I'll show you what you are going to become. And at the end of the day, Solomon loved women more than God. He may have loved God, but his actions show he loved those women more, because he built not just temples for God, as the text goes on in these chapters. What else? Other temples did he build? Temples for their gods too. He loved God, yes, but he didn't love God more. And so I always cringe when somebody says to me, well, God knows my heart and knows I love him. Yes, I'm sure he does. But do you love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Because based on how you're living, you may be showing that that's not the case. Very few people truly repudiate God. They just think God can have a mistress. And God won't tolerate that. All right, real quick, for next week, read up through chapter 14. Read up through chapter 14. God willing, we will get pushed on there next week. Chapter 13 matters because chapter 13, there'll be a prophet that shows up here a little bit to tell Jeroboam he's going to get the kingdom because God's mad at Solomon for his sin. But really, the issue of prophecy, remember back first week we mentioned prophets are the real stars of the book? The issue of prophet and prophecy shows up for the first time in earnest, highlighted in chapter 13 in a very odd story. And we really need to spend some time there next week as well, figuring out what to do with this very, very odd story of these nameless prophets, these nameless men of gods. And what that story means and why it sits where it does and the role it plays in the book, highlighting the prophets as now, as sin is running rampant. Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, it's all falling apart so fast. The role of the prophets and trying to call the people back to God and back to the temple before it's too late and before the consequences collectively become due. And so that chapter matters. It's a weird one. Go back and read it. Next week we'll work that in as well and try to understand the role of that chapter. It's a very important one in the book. All right, thanks for listening tonight. Let's close with a word of prayer, and we'll. Father in heaven, thank you for this opportunity to read and to hear your word, Father. May our response be one of trembling, not in slavish terror or fear, but in awesome reverence of who you are and of the great duty of loyalty and love and worship of you alone, the one who is the only God. May we truly make you the only God of our lives, Father, by how we live, by how we love you, by how we serve and obey, by how we live our lives. May we never fall into the foolish trap of thinking that we can serve you and someone or something else as well. May you be our only true God. May this be reflected in our hearts, our loves, our lives, and give us the strength and courage to do what we need to do to root out the idols that currently exist in our lives. This is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.